The elevator was rigged to kill him. But the only person who noticed was the woman everyone ignored. Enzo Marciano walked through the hotel like a king, surrounded by loyal men. Amelia stood nearby in a gray cleaning uniform, treated like furniture, until she saw the blind spot by the serviced elevator and the countdown hidden in plain sight. When she whispered that his guards were betraying him, Enzo almost dismissed her as nobody. Then Tommaso confirmed the truth. The elevator cables had been cut. If Enzo had stepped inside, the most feared Mafia boss in Manhattan would have died before dinner. The sharp sting of cheap glass cleaner had been scraping Amelia Duarte's throat since morning. By late afternoon, her hands ached from polishing the same endless windows on the 19th floor of the Venetian Grande, where the city looked clean only because it was far enough away. The hotel sold silence as luxury. No one heard the insults tossed at staff, the threats whispered behind closed doors, or the fear that moved beneath the marble. Amelia had learned to keep her eyes low and her face blank. Invisible people survived longer, and she had been surviving that way for 8 years. She was not supposed to be on that floor. Her usual route stayed below the penthouse suites where rich guests complained about towels and breakfast trays, but a sick coworker and a terrified supervisor had pushed her upstairs with one warning: do not linger, do not stare, do not speak unless spoken to. The warning had a name attached to it: Enzo Marciano. Even the senior staff said it softly. Entire suites around his had been emptied, and the men in the hall were not hotel security. They wore tailored suits, earpieces, and the stillness of people paid to kill quickly. Amelia had seen men like that before. Not in suits this fine, but close enough. They were men who entered a room already measuring exits, who smiled without warmth, who touched their phones like every message might start a war. She kept spraying the glass and pretended not to notice them. Pretending was one of her oldest skills. At 17, hiding in her father's pantry, she had watched men her family trusted turn a kitchen into a grave. After that, she studied people because missing one detail could cost everything. The 2 guards near the service elevator were wrong. That was what pulled her attention first. Everyone else faced outward, scanning the hall, but those 2 had placed themselves in a blind spot by the elevator doors. The scarred one kept glancing at his phone. His partner leaned close, read the screen, then shifted his body just enough to block the camera above them. It was not boredom, it was coordination. Amelia's fingers tightened around the bottle until the plastic. She knew the difference between nervousness and guilt. Guilt had a rhythm. The scarred guard smiled at something on his screen. The expression made Amelia's stomach turn cold. 8 years earlier, one of her father's friends had smiled that same way while stirring sugar into her mother's coffee. A man could laugh with you for years and still sell your death for money. Amelia moved to the next pane of glass, slow and quiet, letting her reflection slide closer to the men. The hallway lights flashed across the phone. Italian. Her grandmother's stubborn lessons returned with sudden force. 3 words stood out clearly enough to stop her breath. 15 minutes. Basement entrance. She sprayed the window again to hide the shake in her hand. 15 minutes was not a warning. It was a countdown. The service elevator would take Enzo's party toward the basement, where the private cars waited. The men beside her were not protecting him. They were guiding him toward a trap. Amelia looked down the hall. More guards appeared from the suite, forming a smooth perimeter around the doors. And Enzo Marciano stepped out, speaking into his phone in low Italian, calm enough to make the danger around him seem trained. He was not the crude monster Amelia had imagined from staff gossip. Enzo looked controlled, polished, almost elegant, with a dark suit fitted so perfectly it felt like armor. His presence changed the hallway. Even his own men made space before he asked for it. Yet the phone call hardened his face. Amelia caught only pieces as he passed. Angelo, Atlantic City. Family does not threaten family. The name meant nothing to her, but the tone did. Whoever Angelo was, he had power enough to irritate Enzo, and history enough to be answered instead of ignored. Enzo ended the call with a quiet warning in Italian, then slid the phone into his pocket. For 1 second his eyes swept the hallway and passed over Amelia as if she were part of the wall. She should have been grateful. Invisible meant alive. And this time she saw a second message. Lift first, basement if needed. The words struck harder than the cleaner in her throat. This was not only an ambush, it was layered, planned by someone who knew the exact route and wanted no chance left to luck. Amelia heard her grandmother's voice from years ago. Rough from cigarettes and grief, silence keeps you alive until the day it makes you guilty. Her father had died because no one warned him. Her mother had died because loyalty had been mistaken for safety. The bottle slipped from Amelia's numb hand and cracked against the marble. Blue liquid spread around her shoes. Every guard turned at the sound. She dropped to her knees, grabbing for the rag, buying one last second to decide whether to remain a ghost or become a witness. Enzo moved toward the elevator. The scarred guard stepped with him, too eager, one hand hovering near the control panel. Amelia rose before fear could pin her down. Her heart beat so hard she could feel it in her teeth. A bodyguard shifted to block her, but she moved around the spill with the urgency of someone trying to clean a mess. When she reached Enzo, she kept her voice low. "Mr. Marciano, the men by the service elevator are going to betray you." The hallway went silent. The nearest guard's hand disappeared beneath his jacket. Enzo turned slowly. Up close, his eyes were darker than the hallway shadows, sharp enough to strip lies from a face. "Say that again," he said. Amelia forced herself not to look away. She told him about the messages, the basement entrance, the lift. She told him the scarred guard and his partner had moved into a blind spot. She told him they had less than 12 minutes. Behind Enzo, the elevator doors opened with a soft chime that suddenly sounded obscene. One of Enzo's older guards, silver-haired and heavy-eyed, warned in Italian that she could be a planted distraction. Amelia understood enough to feel the accusation land. She lifted both hands, palms open, rags still hanging from her fingers. "I am nobody," she said. "That is why they were careless around me." Enzo watched her face for a long second, then spoke without looking away. "Tommaso, check the elevator. Carlo, take the 2 men by the service doors alive if possible." The command was quiet. The hallway exploded into motion. The scarred guard reached for his gun first. Carlo hit him hard against the wall before the weapon cleared fabric. The second guard bolted for the service stairs, but another of Enzo's men drove him down with brutal efficiency. Guests behind distant doors began to shout. Amelia stood frozen in the spreading cleaner, while men she had never met dragged traitors across the marble. Enzo still had not moved into the elevator. Then Tommaso's voice cracked through his earpiece, urgent and controlled. The lift cables had been cut. If Enzo had stepped inside, the fall would have killed everyone in it. For the first time, Enzo's expression changed. Not fear, something colder. A door closing inside him. He looked at Amelia as if the gray uniform had fallen away and revealed a different person underneath. "You know this hotel," he said. It was not a question. She swallowed. "The service corridors. Some exits. Then you are coming with us." His hand closed around her wrist, firm but not painful. Amelia started to protest, but another gunshot cracked somewhere below them. The trap had shifted. The basement team already knew the first plan had failed. They pushed through a staff door into the hidden spine of the hotel. Behind the velvet walls and chandeliers, the Venetian Grande became concrete pipes, laundry carts, grease, and stale air. Amelia led because she knew the ugly places. Wealth had a front door. Workers knew the exits. Enzo's men moved behind her in a tight line, guns drawn, shoes scraping where her sneakers made no sound. She pointed left before the main service hall. "Not that way. Cameras and kitchen traffic. There is a maintenance passage behind the linen room." Enzo did not question her. That was what unsettled her most. Powerful men usually demanded proof before trusting anyone beneath them. He simply followed, reading the building through her body. When she slowed, his men slowed. When she raised a hand, they stopped. Somewhere below, boots hit metal stairs. The basement team was moving upward. Amelia slid through a narrow gap beside stacked crates and pulled open a panel she had found during her first week. "This cuts behind the loading bays," she whispered. "It is cramped, but it avoids the main corridor." The tunnel forced them single file. A pipe leaked cold water onto Amelia's sleeve as she moved, counting turns from memory. The hotel above them still played soft piano music for the rich, but down here every sound had teeth. Tommaso murmured into his collar, rerouting vehicles. Carlo reported. The captured guards had swallowed something before they could be questioned. Poison, maybe. Enzo's jaw tightened behind her. Whoever planned this did not expect loose ends to survive. Amelia felt his gaze on the back of her neck and hated how much it steadied her. They reached a 3-way split. Amelia stopped and listened. To the right, kitchen staff argued in Spanish. Ahead, an emergency alarm blinked over a locked gate. To the left, the air smelled of rain and garbage. "Left," she said. "There's an outside door used by smokers. It sticks at the bottom." Enzo stepped beside her. "How does a cleaning woman know escape routes this well?" She pushed the question away. "Because I have been poor longer than you have been hunted. Poor people learn every back door." It was true, just not the whole truth. The outside door groaned when she shoved the bar. For one breath it refused to open. Footsteps pounded closer behind them. Enzo reached over her shoulder and forced the frame with a hard crack. Cold rain blew into the passage. Tommaso and Carlo moved through first, clearing the alley. Amelia followed, blinking into the gray evening. Dumpsters, damp brick, a delivery truck idling half a block away. No glamour, no witnesses. Enzo stepped out last, and only then did Amelia realize his hand had found her wrist again, as if he expected the city itself to snatch her away. 3 black vehicles screamed into the alley from different directions. one decoy too armored. Enzo's men moved fast, but Amelia stayed planted by the door. Her shift was not over. Her bag was in the staff locker. Mrs. Kowalski would mark her absent and maybe fire her. The thought was absurd, but it was also the last piece of normal life within reach. Enzo turned back. "Where do you think you are going?" "Back inside," she said, though even she heard the lie. "No," he answered. "They saw you warn me. That life is gone." The words hit harder than the rain. Amelia shook her head. She had spent 8 years disappearing. She could do it again. Enzo's expression did not soften. "The 2 men you exposed are already dead. The ones who sent them will ask what went wrong. Your face is the answer." Tommaso confirmed it grimly. Hotel cameras had caught her speaking to Enzo. Staff records would give them her name by morning. Amelia's chest tightened. One choice, one sentence in a hallway, and the small life she had built had folded like paper. She tried to pull free. "I did not ask for your protection." "No," Enzo said. "You earned it." The distinction did not comfort her. Protection can be another word for prison. He looked at her for a long moment, and something like recognition moved across his face. "Only if I lock the door from the outside." A bullet snapped into the brick above them, showering dust over Amelia's hair. Carlo shoved her toward the nearest vehicle. Enzo covered her with his body before she could think. The argument ended there. The armored door slammed shut behind them, cutting off the alley and the gunfire. Amelia landed against the leather seat, breath gone, rain dripping from her uniform. Enzo sat beside her, one hand on his phone, issuing orders in Italian with surgical calm. Outside, the SUV lurched into traffic while another vehicle peeled away as bait. Amelia pressed her palm to her ribs. She had not been shot. She had not died. Somehow that did not feel like safety. It felt like crossing a border into a country she had spent her whole adult life avoiding. Enzo ended the call and looked at her. "Tell me your name." "Amelia Duarte, Portuguese. My grandmother was. My father was born in Queens." His eyes sharpened at the word father, but he did not push yet. Instead, he studied her wet hair, her cheap shoes, the cleaner stains on her cuffs. "You recognized the setup before 4 trained men did." Amelia stared at the dark window. "Trained men expect enemies to look like enemies. I learned that friends are worse." The SUV fell quiet except for rain striking the roof. Enzo's phone buzzed, and the temperature in the vehicle seemed to drop. "The captured guards are dead," he said. "Not from us. Cyanide capsules." Amelia closed her eyes. "Professionals, not desperate traitors making a quick move." "Who wants you dead badly enough to spend years inside your security?" she asked before she could stop herself. Enzo's mouth tightened. "Several men. Only one knows my family habits well enough to make this personal." "Angelo," she said, remembering the hallway call. Enzo's silence was answer enough. The name opened something old in him. He explained only what mattered. Angelo Marciano was his cousin, a man with a casino kingdom in Atlantic City, and a smile that made weak men feel chosen. They shared blood, history, and a grave full of family sins. Lately, Angelo had been testing boundaries, offering false apologies, making calls too sweet to trust. Amelia listened, her fear rearranging itself into focus. A stranger's attack could be escaped. Family betrayal was different. Family knew where the doors were hidden, which memories still hurt, and which promises a man might hesitate to break. By the time they reached Brooklyn Heights, the rain had polished the brownstone steps to black glass. Amelia had expected a warehouse or a basement safe house. Instead, Enzo brought her to a quiet building with warm lamps and expensive stonework, the kind of place where neighbors probably argued about flower boxes. Inside, the security was almost invisible: biometric locks, reinforced doors, cameras tucked into corners like patient insects. The third-floor apartment smelled of old wood, clean linen, and money that had never needed to explain itself. It was beautiful. It was also built to withstand a siege. Amelia stopped in front of the tall windows. The city lights blurred beyond the glass. "Bulletproof?" she asked. Enzo's faint smile held no humor. "Everything here is rated for disappointment." He told her the second bedroom was hers for now. Clothes would be brought. Her old phone would be destroyed. Tommaso would stay on site. She could move through the apartment, but not leave without an escort. Amelia heard the practical reasons and still felt the old panic rise. A cage did not become freedom because the sheets were expensive. Enzo noticed. "You can hate the walls," he said, removing his jacket. "Just do not mistake them for your enemy." Amelia turned on him. "Easy to say when you own the key." He accepted the blow without anger. Fair. That single word disarmed her more than a defense would have. He poured whiskey, offered her a glass, and did not seem insulted when she left it untouched. "I am not keeping you here because I enjoy frightened guests," he said. "I am keeping you alive until I understand who tried to use my own men against me." She wanted to tell him she was not part of his war. But the cameras, the dead guards, and the bullet in the alley had already answered that. Instead, she asked, "What happens after you understand?" Enzo looked toward the rain-dark windows. "Then the guilty pay." There was no performance in his voice. No theatrical threat. Just a fact placed on the table. Amelia should have recoiled. Instead, she thought of the men who murdered her parents and walked away untouched. Sometimes the clean world failed because it was too afraid to get dirty. Tommaso brought a folder before midnight. It was thick, old, and ugly with possibilities. Enzo placed it on the table between them. Inside were photographs and records of his closest people: drivers, guards, accountants, warehouse supervisors, cousins, advisors. Amelia did not sit at first. "I am a witness, not an investigator." Enzo opened to the first page. "You saw what my professionals missed, because they believed the uniforms." "Exactly." He pushed the folder closer. "I need someone who does not owe these men loyalty. Someone who knows what betrayal looks like before it introduces itself." Amelia stared at the faces in the folder. Men with families, medals, church donations, clean tax filings, and eyes that may or may not be hiding knives. The task disgusted her because part of her understood it too easily. Her father's company had looked clean from the outside as well. Trucks, invoices, legitimate contracts. Underneath, favors passed through concrete orders and shipping manifests. She had filed papers after school, and heard enough whispers to know that business could become a mask for fear. Her father thought he could stay honorable inside a crooked system. That belief had killed him. Enzo asked about him then carefully. Amelia did not want to answer, but silence felt childish after what she had done. "Money missing from a construction deal," she said. "He thought a friend was stealing from the wrong people. He reported it to men he trusted." She laughed once without humor. "They were the ones stealing." Enzo's face did not change, but his attention sharpened. "You were there, in the pantry." The words still tasted like dust and blood. "And they are terrified." For a while, Enzo said nothing. That restraint mattered. Most people filled trauma with pity, because silence made them uncomfortable. He let the room breathe. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "Then you know why I cannot ask my own house to investigate itself." Amelia looked down at Carlo Benedetti's photograph. Head of security, 15 years loyal. Too loyal, perhaps. Perfect records could mean devotion. They could also mean someone had been careful. "Start with pressure points," she said before thinking. "Money, family, secrets, pride. Betrayal needs a handle." Enzo watched her as if he had just found a hidden blade in a drawer. Amelia almost stepped back from herself, meant to become a woman calmly discussing how men could be broken. Yet the logic was clean. People did not betray without need or hunger. Carlo's wife had a medical history. Matteo, a driver, had gambling markers. Vincent, an accountant's assistant, had a sick child. Louis, who managed warehouse routes, lived richer than his salary allowed. None of it proved guilt. Together, it made a map. In the morning, Tommaso entered with fresh intelligence. The bullet fired in the alley had come from a rooftop contractor, hired under a fake name, moved through a company tied to Atlantic City. Angelo's shadow again. Enzo's expression turned unreadable. "He wants me reacting," he said. Angelo always enjoyed making people swing at smoke. Amelia tapped the folder. "Then don't swing. Let him think the smoke is working." The suggestion settled in the room. Enzo leaned back, measuring her not as a victim now, but as a strategist. The first real test came before dawn. A courier arrived at the brownstone, with a food delivery no one had ordered. Carlo wanted to turn him away. Amelia asked to see the hallway camera first. The courier kept his left shoulder angled away from the lens, as if hiding the bag from the scanner. She noticed the stiffness in his mouth, the way his eyes kept jumping to the elevator. "He is scared," she said. "Not committed. Press him outside, away from the door." Tommaso's men moved. 2 minutes later, they found a tracker inside the delivery bag. Enzo looked at Amelia across the monitors. There was respect there now, sharper and more dangerous than gratitude. "You just saved this safe house," he said. Amelia did not enjoy hearing it. Each useful instinct tied her more tightly to his world. "He was too nervous for a real delivery man," she replied, "and too clean for someone walking in rain." Enzo gave a quiet order. The courier would be questioned, then sent back with a different tracker, one that led to an empty industrial lot. Amelia understood the game immediately. Angelo had sent a hook. They would return a hook of their own. Morning came gray and sleepless. Amelia showered, changed into clothes, chosen by someone who had guessed her measurements too well, and returned to the living room, where Enzo had turned the table into a battlefield. Coffee, laptops, printed ledgers, maps of warehouses and casino properties. He looked tired but not weakened, wearing a charcoal sweater instead of a suit. Without the formal armor, the scars near his jaw were easier to see. Amelia sat across from him. Neither of them mentioned the almost impossible fact that 24 hours earlier, she had been cleaning windows. They followed the money first. Enzo explained the rule without drama. Desperate men became doors other people could open. Matteo's gambling debts had supposedly vanished after a loan from his sister. The sister lived in Tampa, taught 4th grade, and had never moved enough money to cover even a fraction of it. Vincent's son's medical bills were paid through a foundation with no visible donor. Louis had offshore deposits under a name one letter away from his dead mother's. The lies were not loud. They were neat. And that made them more insulting. Amelia pinned dates to a whiteboard. Mateo, Vincent, and Louis had all been in Atlantic City during the same weekend the previous March, each using a different excuse. Family visit, conference, wedding, separately harmless, together impossible to ignore. Enzo stood behind her, close enough that she felt the heat of him, but not so close that he crowded her. That restraint mattered too. He was dangerous, but he was learning where not to push. 3 men, she said. Schedule, money, shipments. If Angelo owned all 3, he could build your murder slowly. Enzo's mouth flattened. Angelo owns nothing of mine. Maybe not yet, Amelia said. But he rented pieces. The phrase made Tommaso glance up from his tablet. Amelia continued tracing lines between names. Matteo could report movement. Vincent could expose accounts. Louis could redirect goods and fund Angelo's strike teams, without touching Angelo's visible money. The pieces clicked into place with a cold elegance. This was not a sudden assassination attempt. It was a takeover plan designed by someone patient enough to let greed do the recruiting. A call came in on a secure line. Enzo put it on speaker. Angelo's voice filled the room, warm and oily, pretending concern. He had heard there was trouble at the hotel. Was cousin Enzo safe? Did he need help? Amelia watched Enzo's face while Angelo spoke. Nothing changed except his eyes. They turned distant, almost amused. Angelo mentioned family 3 times in 2 minutes. He offered men, cars, a private plane. Too generous, too fast. Amelia wrote on the whiteboard, "He needs to know where you are." Enzo read the note and answered Angelo with smooth gratitude, giving him nothing. After the call ended, Amelia said, "He is fishing." Enzo nodded. And impatient. That mattered. Patient men could still be beaten, if forced to move early. They decided to feed him controlled weakness, false financial strain, a rumor of nervous partners, a fake route to a cash transfer. It was the first time Amelia felt the story, bending because of her, not around her. The feeling was frightening but also alive. For years she had reacted. Now she was choosing where the move would land. By evening, Enzo, Vincent, and Louis brought in separately. The questioning rooms were beneath another property, bare concrete with metal chairs bolted to the floor. Amelia expected nausea when she stepped inside. Instead, she felt a calm so cold it frightened her. Enzo offered her one chance to stay upstairs. She shook her head. "I need to see who helped put a bullet over my head." He did not argue. He simply opened the first door. Matteo looked up from the chair, sweating through his shirt before anyone touched him. Matteo broke on the family lie. Enzo asked about the sister in Atlantic City, then named Tampa, then showed a photograph of her house there. The driver tried 3 stories in less than a minute. Amelia watched his eyes, not his mouth. His fear spiked only when Angelo's name appeared on the table. "He paid your markers," she said. "You thought information was harmless. Because you were not the one holding the gun." Matteo began to cry. He had told Angelo routes, hotel times, security rotations. He swore he did not know about the elevator. Amelia believed that part. It did not absolve him. Vincent was harder to hate, and therefore more dangerous. He betrayed Enzo to pay for his son's treatment. The money came through a charitable foundation tied to one of Angelo's shell companies. Vincent wept when Enzo showed him the trail. He said he had convinced himself the files were only numbers, that no one would bleed because of spreadsheets. Amelia felt a brief stab of pity, then remembered her father also died because someone called a document harmless. "Numbers tell killers where to stand," she said. Vincent lowered his head. He had no answer. Louis did not beg. He sat straight in the chair, bruised knuckles resting against the metal arms, and admitted redirecting shipments almost casually. Angelo had offered twice his salary and a clean path offshore if Enzo fell. "You knew people would die," Amelia said. Louis looked at her with tired contempt. "People always die. The question is who gets paid first." Enzo hit him once. The blow cracked through the room, less from rage than judgment. Louis spat blood, then smiled. That smile told Amelia something important. He still believed Angelo could win. After the 3 confessions, Tommaso expected executions. Amelia could see it in the set of his shoulders. Instead, she asked him not to kill them yet. The room went still. "They are more useful alive," she said. Matteo could feed Angelo false movement reports. Vincent could send doctored financials. Louis could redirect shipments pets packed with trackers instead of cargo. Angelo believed he had eyes inside Enzo's house, and make him trust the wrong reflection. Enzo stared at her as if deciding whether to admire or fear what she had become. "You want me to spare men who sold me?" "No," Amelia said. "I want you to delay satisfaction long enough to win." That was different. Revenge was quick. Victory required patience. She laid out the conditions. Their families would be watched but not harmed. Their money would be frozen. Every message would be scripted. One unsupervised word to Angelo, and their usefulness ended. Enzo listened without interrupting. By the time she finished, his anger had cooled into strategy. That night, Amelia did not sleep. She sat near the brownstone windows, watching the city move as if no hidden war had begun. Enzo found her there before sunrise. He did not touch her, though she sensed he wanted to. "You handled the room well," he said. "I handled it too easily." That was the truth that troubled her. He sat across from her instead of beside her. Ease is not the same as cruelty. Amelia looked at him through the dim light. "In your world, how do people know the difference?" Enzo answered quietly. "Some don't. That is why they become monsters." The answer stayed with her. Enzo was not pretending to be clean. That almost made him easier to trust. He knew what he was, knew what his world required, and did not dress it in noble language. Over the next days, they built the trap piece by piece. Matteo reported fake meetings. Vincent sent Angelo doctored financial weakness. Louis rerouted crates filled with trackers and cheap scrap beneath convincing covers. Amelia wrote most of the scripts, removing anything too perfect. Real lies needed flaws. People trusted imperfection because it looked accidental. Angelo bit slowly at first. A cautious question here, a request for confirmation there. Then greed warmed him. His people collected the tracked shipments from Queens and moved them through warehouses Enzo had never been able to prove were his. The maps began to fill with red marks. One center near the river, one restaurant basement in Brooklyn, one casino-linked office in Atlantic City, one private estate in New Jersey. Enzo watched the network reveal itself with patient fury. Amelia watched Angelo's confidence grow in every recorded call. The more Angelo believed Enzo was weakening, the more theatrical he became. He sent messages through old family friends, offering to mediate if Enzo felt overwhelmed. He approached suppliers with condolences disguised as business proposals. He even sent flowers to Enzo's father's grave on the anniversary of his death. That last move changed the room. Enzo read the card once and burned it in a crystal ashtray. Amelia did not speak. Some insults were too intimate for comfort. Angelo was no longer a name in a folder. He had a voice, a style, a cruelty that enjoyed being seen. Amelia studied recordings of Angelo late into the night. His pauses, his phrasing, the way he used affection to hide contempt. He called Enzo cousin when he wanted information, and brother when he wanted forgiveness. He laughed before lying, not after. He flattered weak men by making their greed sound like ambition. The pattern became clear enough that Amelia could predict his next question before it came. Enzo noticed. "You hear him well," he said. "I have heard men like him before," she answered. "They all think Trump makes them invisible." The partnership changed without ceremony. Enzo stopped explaining every order and began asking what Amelia saw. Tommaso brought her reports directly. Carlo argued with her like an equal, which from him seemed almost affectionate. She was still guarded, still unable to leave alone. But the apartment no longer felt only like a cage. It had become a war room. That frightened her in a different way. A prison told you who held power, and power could become addictive if you mistook control for healing. Enzo kept his distance more than Amelia expected. There were moments when the air between them tightened, his hand near hers over a map, his shoulder close at the window, his eyes lingering when she forgot to be guarded. But he never crossed the line. One night she asked why. He looked almost surprised. "Because you have lost enough choices." The answer hurt in a place she had not protected. Desire would have been easier to understand. Respect was more dangerous. Respect made her want to stay for reasons that were not only survival. 2 weeks after the hotel, Angelo made his first real mistake. He sent Matteo a time and place for a meeting, not with Angelo himself, but with one of his lieutenants. Amelia insisted they let Matteo attend under surveillance. Enzo disliked the risk but agreed. In a rain-slick parking structure near the water, Matteo met a man named Bruno Voss, who carried Angelo's confidence like borrowed cologne. The conversation confirmed everything. Angelo believed Enzo's accounts were strained, his security shaken, and his inner circle cracked beyond repair. Bruno also mentioned Amelia, not by name but as the maid. He joked that a cleaning woman had made Enzo jumpy. Matteo laughed on command. Amelia, listening through the van's audio feed, felt a cold thread tighten in her chest. Angelo knew about her. Worse, he had dismissed her. Enzo glanced at her, through the dim light of the surveillance van. "Good," she said before he could apologize for it. "Let him keep thinking I am furniture." Underestimating her was the first gift Angelo had given them. Amelia found a photograph slipped under the brownstone door despite 3 layers of security. It showed her outside the Venetian Grande from weeks earlier. Gray uniform, hair pinned back, head lowered. On the back, one sentence had been written in neat black ink. "Ghosts should stay dead." Enzo's control cracked for half a second. Amelia saw it before he smoothed it away. "He is trying to scare me," she said. No, Enzo answered. He is trying to scare me by showing he can reach you. That was worse. Security doubled. Carlo moved into the apartment full-time. Tommaso changed routes and access codes. Amelia should have felt safer. Instead, the photograph gave her something fear had not: anger with a direction. Angelo had reached backward into her old life, trying to put her in the gray uniform again. She pinned the photo to the whiteboard beneath his name. Leave it there, she told Enzo. I want to remember exactly how small he thinks I am. Enzo looked at her then with something quiet and fierce, but still did not touch her. They accelerated the plan. Vincent's false financial reports showed Enzo moving a major cash reserve through Queens, protected by reduced security. Lewis redirected what appeared to be a high-value shipment toward the same district. Matteo confirmed that Enzo would personally inspect the transfer. Every lie pointed Angelo toward one conclusion: strike now, and he could take the money, humiliate Enzo, and force frightened partners to switch sides. Amelia built the bait to look almost too tempting to resist, then added one small flaw. Angelo loved proving he was smarter than flawed plans. Angelo called Enzo that afternoon. This time, the warmth was gone. You are tired, cousin, he said. People can hear it. Enzo leaned back, one hand resting near the recorder, and let a trace of weariness enter his voice. Amelia had coached him to do it badly enough to be noticed, well enough to be believed. Angelo pressed harder, offering peace if Enzo accepted a smaller place at the table. Enzo ended the call with a quiet insult about men who needed borrowed chairs. Angelo laughed, but the line cut off too sharply. He had taken the bait. That evening, the monitors lit up with movement. 8 men arrived at a Queens warehouse tied to the fake cash transfer. Then 12 more. Another team gathered near a Brooklyn restaurant. A third moved around a casino office in Atlantic City. Angelo was spreading his net wide because he believed Enzo was doing the same. Amelia studied the map, pulse steady now. He is trying to hold 4 doors at once, she said. No one has enough hands for that. Tommaso glanced at Enzo. 4 strike teams. Enzo nodded. At midnight, Amelia asked about civilians. Enzo answered before she finished. The restaurant would be cleared through a fake gas leak. The casino office would be emptied by a staged accounting raid. The Queens warehouse had been vacant for months. The estate in New Jersey was Angelo's own fortress. Whatever Enzo was, he was not careless with bystanders. That distinction mattered to Amelia more than she wanted to admit. It was not morality, not exactly. It was control. Violence without limits had killed her family. Violence with rules still frightened her, but it did not feel the same. Enzo told her she would remain at the brownstone with Carlo. She had expected it and still hated it. Partners do not hide behind monitors. Partners know where they are most useful, he replied. Your plan wins tonight. My men only carry it. That was not flattery. It was a clean assessment. Amelia wanted to argue, but the truth stood between them. Her mind had built the trap. Her presence in the field would give Angelo another target. Enzo stepped closer, stopping just short of touching her face. Do not make me protect you from your own pride. The words should have angered her. Instead, they landed where the old fear lived. She did not want to be protected, because protection had always meant being moved. Hidden, silenced. Enzo seemed to understand before she said it. This is not dismissal, he said. It is trust. I am leaving the board with you. Amelia looked at the screens. The maps, the lines she had drawn. Waiting could be a form of command if she refused to feel powerless inside it. She nodded once. Then do not die before I finish giving orders. His smile was brief and real. By 11:30, black vehicles rolled into the rain. Enzo left without ceremony, because ceremony made fear too visible. Carlo locked the door behind him and took position near the monitors. Amelia stood at the center of the room with a headset over one ear, whiteboard behind her, live feeds ahead. The city outside looked unaware, soft with wet light. Inside, every second had weight. She had no gun in her hands. She had something more unnerving, the plan and the authority to adjust it if the night turned against them. At midnight, Queens went dark first. Enzo's team cut power to the warehouse block, then entered through the roof while Angelo's men watched the front. On the feed, Amelia saw shapes move like shadows through broken skylights. Tommaso's voice came through calm and clipped. Contact. 2 down. Hallway clear. In Brooklyn, the restaurant emptied under the fake gas order, and Enzo's second team entered through the kitchen. In Atlantic City, paid police sirens forced Angelo's office crew into the alley, where Enzo's men were already waiting. The plan worked for 6 minutes, then Angelo adapted. A backup convoy left the New Jersey estate earlier than expected, heading toward Queens. Carlo swore under his breath. Amelia leaned over the map, measuring distance and timing. If the convoy reached Queens, Enzo's team would be trapped between 2 forces. She opened the channel, Route them to the river road, she said. Tommaso asked how. Trigger the construction detour we planted for tomorrow. Now. Carlo looked at her once, then sent the order. 2 minutes later, Angelo's convoy turned exactly where she needed it to. The detour pushed the convoy into a narrow industrial street lined with empty lots. Enzo's third team closed behind them. Amelia watched headlights stop one by one as spike strips shredded tires in the rain. Gunfire flashed white across the monitors. She forced herself not to look away. This was her adjustment, her decision. Men were falling because she had moved a line on a map. Carlo's voice came low beside her. Necessary. Amelia did not answer. Necessary was not the same as clean, and she refused to pretend otherwise. By 12:23 of Angelo's outer positions had collapsed. Queens secured, Brooklyn secured, Atlantic City secured with 6 arrests staged to look like a gambling investigation. The trackers inside Lewis's crates led Enzo's men to a hidden cache of weapons. Cached documents connecting Angelo to every compromised employee. The net was tightening. Only the New Jersey estate remained. On the main feed, Enzo stood outside the iron gates under hard rain, his coat dark, his face unreadable. Angelo's fortress had lights in every window. A cornered man had finally understood he was cornered. The assault on the estate was not clean. Amelia had known it would not be. But knowing and watching were different things. Angelo's men fought from windows and behind stone walls, desperate and loud. Enzo's team moved with discipline, but discipline did not stop bullets. One of his men fell near the gate. Another dragged him back by the collar. Amelia heard Enzo order smoke at the west side, breach at the east. His voice stayed steady. That steadiness became the rope she held in the dark room, while the screens filled with rain, fire, and movement. At 12:41, the gates broke. At 12:50, the main house was breached. Then the feed cut to static. Amelia went still. Carlo tried 3 channels and got nothing but noise. The silence lasted 5 minutes, then 7. Every old fear returned with sharp teeth. She remembered being 17, trapped behind pantry wood, not knowing which scream would be the last. She had thought herself beyond that helplessness. She was wrong. Waiting for someone to walk back out of violence could strip a person bare. The feed returned with a burst of sound. Enzo stood inside a study lined with dark shelves, blood on his shirt but no visible wound. Behind, Angelo Marciano was tied to a chair, one eye swelling, his expensive composure torn to pieces. Relief hit Amelia so hard she had to grip the table. Enzo looked into the camera as if he could see her. "Carlo," he said. "Bring Amelia." Carlo was already reaching for his coat. Amelia stared at the screen. She understood then that the battle was over, but the reckoning had been saved for her. The drive to New Jersey blurred through rain and emergency lights that no one seemed to question. Amelia sat beside Carlo in silence, the photograph from Angelo folded in her coat pocket. At the estate, the air smelled of wet grass, smoke, and gunpowder. Men moved bodies and evidence with grim efficiency. Enzo waited at the door. Amelia walked to him too quickly, then stopped herself inches away. His eyes softened for 1 second. "Not my blood," he said, before she could ask. And this time neither of them pretended not to notice. He led her through halls crowded with ugly wealth, gold fixtures, marble animals, portraits too large for the rooms. Angelo had built a palace that shouted because he had never trusted silence. In the study, he lifted his battered face and smiled through blood. "So this is the maid," he said. "The ghost who taught my cousin to be afraid." Enzo stepped forward, but Amelia raised a hand, not to protect Angelo, to claim the room before he could turn her into an insult. She moved closer until Angelo had to look up at her. "You knew my name," she said. Angelo's smile thinned, eventually. "But you still called me the maid, because it made you feel taller." His eyes flicked to Enzo. "Careful, cousin. She thinks sharp words make her family." The room changed. Enzo's expression froze, but Amelia kept her gaze on Angelo. "Men like you always reach for family when power slips. You use blood as a shield after using it as a knife." Angelo laughed, then coughed. "Family is power. Outsiders are tools." The sentence cut close because Amelia had feared it herself. She turned to Enzo. This was the question she had been avoiding since the hallway. Not whether he desired her insight, not whether he was grateful, but whether he saw her as a person with power of her own. "Where do I stand in your world?" she asked. The room went silent. Enzo did not answer quickly. "That mattered. Beside me," he said at last. "Not behind me, not beneath me. Beside me if you still choose it after tonight." Angelo sneered. Beautiful words before the next betrayal. Amelia looked back at him and saw every man who had sat at her family's table with murder already planned. For years she had imagined justice as a courtroom. A verdict, a clean ending that never came. Now justice sat tied to a chair, bleeding and afraid, and it was uglier than she had dreamed. Enzo asked quietly, "Do you believe he can be allowed to live?" It was not permission he needed. It was witness. A line crossed together. Amelia answered with the calm that had been forming in her all night. No, Angelo began to bargain at once, offering names, routes, money, secrets. The offers came too quickly. and that was what stopped her. A frightened man begged for mercy. Angelo was performing usefulness. Amelia looked at Enzo. Do not kill him yet. Tommaso's hand paused near his weapon. Enzo's eyes sharpened. You just said he cannot live free, she said. He cannot live free. But a dead man gives us nothing. A living coward tells us who else is waiting. The room went silent except for Angelo's rough breathing. For the first time, his smile faltered. Death had not scared him as much as being kept alive and used. Enzo understood at once. He stepped closer to his cousin and spoke softly enough that the threat felt private. You wanted to turn my house into a trap. Now you will help me turn yours into one. Angelo spat a curse. Amelia did not flinch. She saw the truth in his eyes. He had not acted alone. Killing him now would end a chapter, while the book stayed open. Outside, rain had softened to mist. Enzo stopped beside the waiting car and searched Amelia's face. Are you all right? The question was not strategic. It was human, and that made it harder to answer. She thought about lying. Instead, she said, I do not know yet. His expression shifted, something like pain crossing it. Behind them, guards dragged Angelo toward a second vehicle, alive and furious. The night had not ended. It had changed shape. Amelia realized the real war would be slower than a gunshot and much harder to survive. Enzo asked why she had spared him. Amelia pulled Angelo's photograph from her pocket and tore it once, then again, until the gray uniformed version of herself was only wet paper in her palm. Because men like him hide behind other men, she said, if we shoot the face. The hands keep moving. Enzo watched the pieces fall. And what do you want me to become in this plan? She asked. His answer came without calculation. Whatever you choose. I only ask that you do not choose out of fear. That answer loosened something inside her, more than any promise of protection could have. Amelia stepped closer and kissed him first. Not surrender. It was a dangerous choice made with clear eyes in the rain. Enzo held himself still for half a breath, then drew her in with a restraint that made the heat between them feel even sharper. When they parted, he said, this changes things. Then we set rules, Amelia answered. Partners first. No decisions about my life without me in the room. By dawn, Angelo was hidden in a windowless room beneath one of Enzo's old properties, breathing, guarded, and stripped of every illusion of command. His first interrogation produced nothing useful. The second produced names that were too obvious. The third produced a lie that mattered. He kept mentioning a ledger as if it had been destroyed. But each time Twitchy said the word, his left hand twitched against the table. Amelia noticed. Enzo saw her notice. A dead cousin would have taken that secret into the ground. A living one had already made his first mistake. The three traitors became tools, but not the way they expected. Matteo fed Angelo's remaining men false routes. Vincent sent doctored accounts that suggested Enzo was moving emergency cash. Louis redirected crates carrying trackers instead of product. Every message was written to sound like panic. Angelo's people took the bait because they wanted Enzo broken. Amelia learned something important in those first days. Greed did not only corrupt loyalty, it also made men predictable. Offer them the victory they want badly enough, and they will walk toward it with both eyes open. Amelia did not return to the Venetian Grande. Mrs. Kowalski left 3 frightened messages, then stopped. The hotel replaced her within a week, as places like that always did. Her old locker was emptied by someone else. The gray uniform disappeared into a laundry bin. For a while, Amelia mourned that small life more than she expected. It had been hard, humiliating, lonely, but it had been hers. Now even sleep came with guards outside the door and coded calls before breakfast. Choosing Enzo's world had not freed her from fear. It had taught fear a new language. The missing ledger became the center of every hour. Angelo denied it existed. His accountant disappeared before Tommaso's men reached him, emptied 2 days before the hotel ambush. Then a burner phone rang in Angelo's seized study. Enzo answered on speaker. No one spoke for 3 seconds. Then a woman's voice said, if Angelo dies, every name burns. The line went dead. Amelia felt the room tighten around her. Angelo had not built a coup. He had built insurance, and someone else was holding the key. Their work became a rhythm sharpened by pressure. Mornings were reports, afternoons were interrogations, nights were maps and quiet arguments. Amelia learned the names of men who smiled too often, and women who moved money through charities. Enzo learned to let someone question him, without hearing betrayal in it. That may have been the greater change. Power had trained him to treat doubt as danger. Amelia did not fear his temper enough to flatter him, and he respected her too much to demand it. Between them, strategy became another kind of intimacy. There were still lines she refused to cross. Children were untouchable. Wives and parents could be watched, protected, pressured through legal means, but not harmed. Enzo accepted the rule because she made him see what uncontrolled leverage created. Fear without loyalty, obedience without trust. Angelo had built his network through terror, and terror had made every man around him eager to survive him. Amelia wanted something colder and stronger. Make them afraid to betray you, she told Enzo, but give them a reason not to want to. News of Angelo's capture did not travel, but silence has a shape, and rivals felt the empty space immediately. Some crews tested the edges. Others went quiet too quickly. That worried Amelia more. The missing ledger could destroy more than Angelo. If it named judges, captains, police commanders, and old family allies, then half the city had a reason to keep Enzo from finding it. 3 days after the estate raid, a car followed Amelia's security detail for 17 blocks. It never attacked. It only wanted her to know she could still be seen. One evening, Enzo took her to the cemetery, where his father was buried because he needed to think somewhere no one would interrupt him. No guard stood close enough to hear. The stone was simple compared to the empire built in his name. Enzo told her his father had believed betrayal could be solved by removing the betrayer. He was wrong, Amelia said. Betrayal is rarely one man. It is a room full of people deciding silence is safer. Enzo looked at the grave. Then we find the room. A week later, Amelia visited her parents' grave for the first time in 3 years. Enzo came with her but stayed back until she asked him closer. The stone had weathered badly. She cleaned the letters with her sleeve, angry at herself for crying and angrier that the tears felt like relief. Then she noticed fresh mud near the fence and a cigarette brand her father had hated. Someone had been there recently, not a mourner, a watcher. The past was not behind her after all. It had become another door in Angelo's maze. That night, Enzo placed old files in front of her and said, "When you are ready." The names of her parents' killers were there, addresses, businesses, grown children, protected lives. But one document did not belong, a construction contract signed by a company tied to Angelo's vanished accountant. Amelia stared at the date until the room seemed to tilt. Her father's murder and Angelo's ledger touched the same old corruption. The men who killed her family had not simply betrayed her father. They had helped bury a financial trail someone was still protecting. Amelia did not sleep. She followed deeds, shell companies, court filings, union contracts, dead witnesses, missing invoices. Morning, the whiteboard had become a map of 2 wars that were actually won. The city contracts her father had questioned years ago had funded the first layer of Angelo's network. The missing ledger was not just a list of traitors inside Enzo's house. It was a record of every powerful man who had profited from old blood. Enzo stood behind her in silence. He finally understood why the enemy had reached for her grandmother's photograph before she ever became famous. The next move came from Amelia, not Enzo. She leaked a false rumor that Angelo had confessed and that the ledger would be moved through the Venetian Grande, hidden inside a routine hotel delivery. It was bait shaped like memory. Enzo hated using the place where she had nearly died. Amelia hated it too, which was why she knew the enemy would believe it. Monsters trusted old wounds. They expected victims to avoid them. At midnight, 3 separate crews moved toward the hotel, all pretending not to know one another. The room had finally begun to show itself. The trap almost failed. A 4th team arrived through the staff entrance, wearing maintenance uniforms and carrying real work orders. Amelia recognized the leader from a photograph in her father's file. Older now, heavier, but with the same flat eyes she had seen through the pantry crack. For 1 second she was 17 again, unable to breathe. Then Enzo's voice came through her earpiece. "Amelia, stay with me." She looked at the monitor, forced the terror into shape, and gave the order to close the service corridors. This time, she was not hiding behind the door. The capture was quiet enough that guests upstairs never knew. By 2 in the morning, 4 men sat in separate rooms beneath the hotel, and one of them was the last living man who had eaten at Amelia's family table before selling them out. He tried to say her father's name with regret. Amelia stopped him. "You do not get to borrow his name to soften yours." Enzo stood in the corner silent, letting the room belong to her. The man confessed because fear had finally become larger than loyalty. His words gave them the ledger's location. The ledger was not paper. It was a drive sealed behind a false panel in the old hotel laundry. Taped above pipes Amelia had cleaned around for 3 weeks, without knowing what slept there. That almost made her laugh. Powerful men had hidden their sins in the one place they trusted no one important would look. Tommaso retrieved it, while Amelia stood beside the humming machines. The room smelled of bleach, steam, and old cloth. She thought of every worker who had passed beneath that secret without being seen. Invisible people had carried the weight of the city without ever being told what was above them. The drive changed everything. It named Angelo's buyers, his protectors, and the council of older bosses who had financed the coup while pretending to mourn family tragedy. Dominic Vale's name appeared 3 times, always beside accounts that moved through Boston charities. Judges appeared. A police commander Enzo had once called allies. Killing Angelo would not have touched them. Exposing all of them would start a war too large to control. Amelia looked at the screen and felt the hook of a new danger settle into place. The real enemy had not been Angelo. Angelo had been the loudest symptom. Respect did not arrive all at once, but fear did. Captains who had doubted Amelia stopped smiling at meetings. Men who once waited for her to fail began waiting for her to speak. Enzo did not use the drive immediately. Amelia made him wait. "If we burn every name tonight, they unite against us by morning," she said. "If we let each man wonder which name we know and which name we do not, they will start betraying one another before we lift a hand." Enzo studied her for a long moment. "Quiet knife," Tommaso murmured. Amelia hated how well the name fit. The first message went to Dominic Vale, one scanned page, no threat, no demand. Just proof. By sunset, 3 minor bosses requested meetings under peaceful terms. By midnight, a judge resigned for health reasons no one believed. The city shifted without a shot fired. Amelia understood then that power was not always the moment of impact. Sometimes power was the silence before impact. When guilty men listened for footsteps and heard their own hearts instead, Enzo's property, heard about the unraveling, and finally stopped smiling. Enzo visited Angelo alone the next morning and returned with his jaw tight. Angelo had offered one final bargain. The name of the woman who had called about the ledger. His price was exile, a villa cash, a new identity, the coward's dream of surviving his own treason. Enzo wanted to refuse on principle. Amelia asked one question. Did he give the name first? Enzo looked at her and smiled without warmth. "Of course not. And he is still playing you," she said. "Let him think he is winning. Men like him get careless when they can smell escape." They staged Angelo's transfer 2 nights later. A convoy left the property carrying a hooded prisoner. Another carried the real Angelo through a service route only 4 people knew. The woman who had made the ledger call took the bait. Her men struck the decoy first, then panicked when they found the wrong prisoner inside. In that panic, one of them called a number Dominic Vale had claimed he no longer used. The connection lasted 6 seconds. It was enough. The council's hand was no longer theory. It was a line on a screen. Amelia still stood at the bulletproof windows and remembered the woman in the gray uniform. She did not hate that version of herself. The cleaning woman had been brave in ways no one saw, but she also understood something colder now. Bravery without strategy could become another offering placed at the feet of cruel men. Enzo came up behind her, not touching until she leaned back first. "We have them," he said. "No," Amelia answered. "We have proof they exist. Now we make them afraid of each other." Enzo once asked whether she regretted speaking to him in the hallway. Amelia took her time answering. Regret was too simple for what followed: danger, blood, power, grief, desire, and the impossible relief of being seen. "No," she said at last, "but I miss not knowing what I was capable of." Enzo understood. Knowledge could be a burden as heavy as guilt. Before he could answer, Tommaso entered with a new report. Angelo had tried to pass a message through a guard. The message contained one word: Dominic. Angelo finally broke when he realized Dominic intended to erase him too. He gave them the woman's name, the council route, and the date of the next private meeting in Boston. Then, like all cowards, he tried to make his confession sound noble. He said he had only wanted to modernize the family. Enzo was too sentimental. He said Amelia was proof that outsiders corrupted blood. Amelia listened until he ran out of excuses. "No," she said quietly. "I am proof that blood is not loyalty." This time, there was nothing useful left to keep alive. Enzo did not ask Amelia to decide for him, and she respected him more for that. Angelo was his blood, his wound, his consequence. Still, he let her stand beside him, not because he needed permission, but because partners did not hide the cost from each other. Angelo tried to bargain one last time. No one answered. Tommaso made it quick in the next room. Amelia heard the single shot and closed her eyes, not in horror, but in acknowledgement. A chapter had ended. The war behind it had not. Venetian Grande kept shining above the city, polishing its glass and hiding its secrets. Somewhere on another floor, another invisible worker might be noticing what powerful men failed to hide. Amelia liked to think that mattered. Her story did not prove that suffering made people stronger. Suffering only hurt. What mattered was what she built after refusing to disappear. She had been a witness, then a target, then a partner. Angelo's death gave them one victory, not peace. The ledger still pointed toward men with cleaner hands, colder smiles, and far more to lose. But being difficult to break did not mean being safe. The first winter after Angelo's death brought new men to the edge of Enzo's territory, each one testing the rumor of the woman who had changed the rules. Amelia watched them the way she once watched hotel guests, quietly, patiently, without giving away what she had already seen. Some came with smiles. Some came with gifts. The most dangerous came with respect that arrived too quickly. She had learned that honest respect took time. Fast respect usually wanted something. One of those men was Dominic Vale, an old associate from Boston with silver hair, soft hands, and a voice warm enough to make threats sound like concern. He arrived with a business proposal, and 3 bodyguards, who scanned the brownstone as if measuring where the walls might crack. Enzo disliked him on sight. Amelia disliked him for a different reason. Dominic never looked directly at her when he answered her questions. Men who feared a woman's intelligence often pretended she was invisible. Amelia knew what invisibility could reveal. At dinner, Dominic praised Enzo's recovery and called Angelo's fall a family tragedy. Amelia set down her glass. A tragedy is when grief arrives without being invited, she said. Angelo planned his ending for years. The table quieted. Dominic smiled as if amused, but his fingers tightened around his fork. Enzo said nothing. He let Amelia hold the silence. Dominic eventually turned to her and asked what title he should use. Amelia answered, "The one that reminds you I am listening." The meal continued, but the mask had slipped. After Dominic left, Tommaso reported that one of his guards had tried to photograph the security panel near the service hall. Carlo wanted to send a message immediately. Amelia disagreed. "Let him believe he succeeded," she said. They replaced the panel code with a dead route leading to an empty storage level, and planted false shipping schedules in the visible system. Enzo watched her work with a look that still made her uneasy, not because it doubted her, but because it trusted her completely. Trust was precious. It was also heavy. 3 days later, the dead route caught its first visitor. A young man from Dominic's crew entered the wrong floor carrying a lock bypass and a pistol with the serial number filed away. He surrendered before anyone fired. Under questioning, he admitted Dominic had been hired to learn whether Enzo's new security depended too much on one woman. Amelia almost laughed at that. They still did not understand. She was not the weakness in the system. She was the reason. The system expected weakness and prepared for it. Enzo wanted Dominic dealt with before sunrise. Amelia asked for 1 more hour. She traced the payment backward through 2 shell companies and found the real sponsor. Enzo's restructured operation would spread and make their own corruption easier to expose. They did not want war yet. They wanted proof he could be destabilized. Amelia drafted the reply herself. Dominic would be returned alive, humiliated, and carrying documents that showed every sponsor had already been identified. Fear, delivered neatly, could prevent more blood than rage. The reply worked. By morning, 3 minor bosses requested meetings under peaceful terms. Enzo gave Amelia the choice to attend or stay hidden. She attended. In the conference room, the men avoided her eyes until she opened the first folder. Then they looked at nothing else. Did not raise her voice. Did not lean on Enzo's reputation. She simply showed them their own secrets in a calm order, ending with the one thing powerful men hated most: proof that someone else understood them better than they understood themselves. That was the day the rumors changed. The men stopped calling her the maid, even behind closed doors. They began calling her the quiet knife. Amelia hated the name at first. It sounded dramatic, like something whispered by people who enjoyed violence from a safe distance. But Enzo reminded her that names given by enemies were often maps of what they feared. They did not fear her beauty, her past, or her connection to him. They feared how little noise she made before finding the truth. Fame inside a criminal world was its own kind of danger. Amelia received letters with no return address, photographs of places she had once lived, old bills, copies of school records, scraps of a life she thought had been buried. Each one tried to remind her that no reinvention was complete. Enzo offered to burn them unread. She refused. Fear became smaller when studied. She filed every letter, marked every postmark, matched handwriting to known crews, and turned each threat into another thread on the board. One letter was different. It contained a photograph of Amelia's grandmother, taken years earlier outside a church in Newark. Her grandmother had died before Amelia's parents, but the image still made the room tilt. On the back was written, "Roots can be dug up." For the first time in months, Amelia lost her composure. Enzo found her in the hallway, with the photograph crushed in her hand. He did not ask who had sent it. He only asked what she needed. That question kept her standing. The answer surprised them both. She did not ask for blood. She asked for the church records, the caretaker's name, and every person who had accessed the cemetery archive in the past 6 months. By dawn, Tommaso found the leak, a retired clerk selling family records to whoever paid cash. The man had no idea what the information would be used for. Amelia wanted to hate him more than she did. Instead, she saw another small person turning a key, without caring which door it opened. Enzo asked what punishment she wanted. Amelia thought carefully before answering. The clerk lost his access, his pension fraud was exposed, and the money he had taken was redirected into a fund for families of murdered witnesses. It was not mercy, it was usefulness. Later, Enzo told her that old Amelia might have chosen differently. She shook her head. Old Amelia would have hidden under the bed. This Amelia knows revenge should accomplish something. Enzo accepted the correction with a small smile. spring changed the city, and the brownstone filled with open windows when security allowed it. Amelia began walking the neighborhood with 2 guards at a distance. At first, every passing car made her shoulders tighten. Then the walks became a habit. A bakery on the corner learned her coffee order. A florist tried to sell her lilies every week and laughed when she refused. Normal life did not return all at once. It arrived in pieces, and she learned not to distrust every small piece just because it was fragile. One morning, a young maid from the Venetian Grande recognized her outside the bakery. The girl froze, then looked away quickly, embarrassed by the old rule that staff should not stare. Amelia bought 2 coffees and handed her one. The girl whispered that the 19th floor had become worse since Enzo's incident. More rules, more fear. Amelia gave her a card with no name, only a number. "Call if something feels wrong," she said. The girl stared at it like it was impossible. Amelia the phone understood. Help often looked suspicious to people used to being ignored. The call came 2 months later, not from the girl, but from her cousin, a dishwasher who had found a gun hidden behind a staff freezer before a political fundraiser at the hotel. Enzo's people handled it quietly. Police arrived with a tip just in time to arrest a man tied to a rival crew. No civilians were hurt. Amelia never told the maid how close the night had come to blood. She only sent enough money for the girl to leave the hotel and start training as a nurse. Sometimes power was most satisfying when no one knew it had moved. That small rescue unsettled Amelia more than the larger victories. It proved she could change the direction of harm before it arrived. For years, she had believed the best she could do was survive what powerful men decided. Now she could interrupt those decisions. Enzo saw the shift in her. "You are building your own network," he said one night. Amelia expected teasing, but his tone held respect. "Not a criminal one," she replied. "A warning system," he nodded. "Those are often more dangerous." Her warning system grew carefully. Hotel staff, drivers, nurses, clerks, waitresses, bookkeepers, people who heard everything because no one important bothered to lower their voices around them. Amelia paid fairly, protected fiercely, and never asked anyone to take risks she would not understand. Information came in differently from these people, less polished, more human. They noticed bruises under sleeves, strange deliveries, sudden changes in tone. Enzo's traditional sources gave him strategy. Amelia's people gave him weather. Together, they could feel storms forming earlier. Not everyone in Enzo's organization liked it. Some captains resented receiving warnings from people they considered beneath them. Amelia let them resent it until one ignored a waitress's report about a backroom meeting and nearly lost a shipment. After that, she called him into the operations room and made him read the woman's message aloud, every word, every detail he had dismissed. When he finished, she asked whether pride had protected the cargo. The man apologized to the waitress in person by noon. Enzo did not order it. Amelia did. Authority changed her voice, not by making it louder but by removing the old habit of apology. She still felt fear. She still woke some nights with her hands clenched in the sheets. But fear no longer automatically meant retreat. It had become information, a signal to slow down and look harder. Enzo understood that better than anyone. When nightmares pulled him out of sleep, Amelia did not ask him to explain. She simply reached for him in the dark, and he came back to the room by following her breathing. Their love remained private because public softness invited knives. In meetings, they were disciplined, sometimes cold. At home, their tenderness lived in quiet rituals, coffee left near a stack of files, a hand briefly at the back before entering a dangerous room. The way Enzo stood between Amelia and cameras without making it look like protection. She did the same for him in her own language, catching lies before they reached his blind spots, challenging him when grief dressed itself as strategy. On the anniversary of the hotel ambush, Enzo asked what she wanted. Amelia thought about the question all day. Not jewelry, not a dinner in a room filled with men, pretending not to watch them. At sunset, she asked him to drive with no destination for 1 hour. No guards inside the car, only a trailing team far enough back to let silence feel possible. Enzo hesitated, then agreed. They crossed bridges, past laundromats and churches, expensive towers and broken sidewalks. The city that had hunted her also held her life. She was ready to see both. During that drive, Amelia told Enzo something she had never said aloud. She had not warned him in the hallway because she was brave. She had done it because she was tired of being the only person left alive from a table full of ghosts. She had wanted for 1 second to make the past lose. Enzo kept his eyes on the road. "That is bravery," he said. She almost argued. Then she let the words sit. Maybe courage did not have to feel clean to be real. Enzo took her to a small diner in Queens where no one knew his face. Or if they did, they pretended well enough. They ate bad pie and burnt coffee under fluorescent lights, while rain began again outside. Amelia laughed for no strategic reason. The sound surprised them both. Enzo looked at her as if the laugh were rarer than any victory they had won. For a few minutes, they were not boss and partner, not targets, not survivors holding a city by its hidden wires. They were simply two tired people sharing pie after midnight. Peace like that could not last forever, but it did not need to. It only needed to exist long enough to remind them why control mattered, not for money alone, not for territory, for the possibility of ordinary moments stolen back from violent men. Amelia began to understand that power was not the opposite of fear. Power was the ability to create small rooms where fear did not get the final word. The diner became one of those rooms. The brownstone kitchen became another. Eventually, so did the space beside Enzo. When summer came, Enzo offered Amelia a formal legal role in his legitimate companies, Director of Risk Intelligence. The title sounded almost respectable, which made her laugh. Still, she accepted because legitimate paper created shields that guns could not. She built compliance teams that actually worked, not because the empire had become clean, but because fewer dirty corners meant fewer places for enemies to hide. Some lawyers underestimated her until she corrected their own contracts from memory. Enzo watched those meetings with quiet pleasure, saying nothing until the room understood on its own. The public world saw a different Amelia Duarte, composed, elegant, measured. A woman who spoke rarely and made boards uncomfortable when she did. Reporters called her mysterious. Rivals called her dangerous. Staff called her fair. That last one mattered most. She remembered how it felt to be spoken to like furniture. In every office she touched, service staff were paid on time. Security protocols included them. No one was punished for reporting what made them uneasy. It was not kindness alone. It was respect turned into structure. The young former maid from the hotel sent a photograph from nursing school. Amelia stared at it longer than expected. The girl stood in blue scrubs, smiling awkwardly, alive in a future that had almost been stolen by a hidden gun and powerful men's carelessness. Amelia placed the photo in her desk drawer beside her father's old company badge. Two reminders, one of what had been lost, one of what could still be protected. Enzo saw the drawer once and never mentioned it. That was how she knew he understood. The city kept changing around them. New alliances formed. Old enemies died or adapted. Enzo's name still opened doors and closed mouths. But Amelia's name changed conversations before he entered the room. People prepared better when they knew she might read the file. They lied less carelessly. They looked at workers twice. That, more than any whispered title, told Amelia she had altered the shape of the world around her. Not enough to make it safe. Enough to make danger work harder. There were days when the cost still found her. A body discovered in a warehouse. A mother crying over a son who had chosen the wrong loyalty. A call from Tommaso at 3 a.m. Amelia never became numb, though she sometimes wished she could. Enzo told her numbness was overrated. Numb people made sloppy decisions because they stopped noticing the weight of them. Pain controlled and faced directly kept the hand from becoming careless. Amelia hated that he was right. She loved him a little more for admitting the price. Their arguments became part of the legend too. Staff learned to avoid the operations room when Amelia's voice went quiet and Enzo stopped moving. Once, over the fate of a traitor who had protected his younger brother, they fought for 2 hours. Enzo wanted finality. Amelia wanted leverage and proof. She won, not because Enzo yielded to love, but because her plan was better. The brother later exposed smuggling route that would have cost them 3 men. Enzo apologized in private. Amelia accepted in private. In public, the decision simply stood. That was the foundation of them, not romance replacing power, but power learning to answer to truth. Amelia had no illusions about the man she loved. Enzo could be ruthless, controlling, and frighteningly calm when others panicked. He also listened when listening cost him pride. Enzo had no illusions about her either. Amelia could be cold, relentless, and unforgiving when a pattern became clear. She also remembered the powerless because she had been one of them. Neither saved the other by making them gentle. They saved each other by making honesty survivable. On the 2nd anniversary of the ambush, Amelia returned alone to the 19th floor of the Venetian Grande. She wore a dark coat instead of a gray uniform. No one stopped her. The hallway had changed again. New carpets, new cameras, new staff, pretending the walls had never seen blood. She stood by the window she had been cleaning that day, and placed her palm against the glass. The city beyond it glittered like a promise that could not be trusted. She smiled faintly. Trust was no longer required. She had learned to verify. Enzo waited in the lobby because she had asked him to. When she came down, he did not ask what she had felt upstairs. Some things did not need translation. He simply offered his hand. She took it in front of everyone, not as a rescued woman, not as a possession, as a choice made again with open eyes. Outside, the hotel doorman looked carefully away, but Amelia caught his small smile. Invisible people saw more than they were given credit for. She hoped they always would. That night, back at the brownstone, Amelia opened a blank file, and wrote the first rule of the system she had built: never ignore the person everyone else overlooks. The second came easier: loyalty without pressure is only a theory. The third took longer: protection must not become control. She stared at that line until Enzo came in with coffee. He read it over her shoulder and said, "Keep it." She did. Some rules were not for the organization. Some were for them. Years would not make their life simple. Men like Enzo did not retire into peace, and women like Amelia did not forget how to read danger. But the story that began with a cleaning woman and a cut elevator cable became something larger than fear. It became a method, a partnership, a warning to anyone who believed the quiet person in the corner was harmless. Amelia had once survived by lowering her eyes. Now she survived by looking directly at what others wanted hidden. She did not become good in the way bedtime stories require. Enzo did not become safe in the way ordinary love demands. And in their world, honesty was rarer than mercy. He gave her reach. She gave him sight. Together they turned pain into structure, grief into judgment, and love into a discipline strong enough to withstand ambition, blood, and memory. They were not clean. They were not innocent. They were alive, awake, and no longer alone. And somewhere in the city, glass still needed polishing, floors still needed scrubbing, and powerful men still forgot that invisible people had eyes. Amelia Duarte never forgot. Every system she built, every threat she caught, every life she quietly redirected away from violence began with that truth. The world had tried to make her small enough to miss. Instead, she became the warning no traitor could afford to ignore. Enzo Marciano had survived because she spoke once. They both endured because, after that, she never went silent again.